Hi there, welcome to this session on the missing middle. This is primarily a how-to session. The question I'm trying to answer is how do we work toward ethical futures when government and industry is so focused on business as usual? We all know the world is on fire. Some people predict widespread collapse, others conflict, some are simply concerned about a loss of wealth. Regardless of the nature and the extent of the crisis, all of us in this room are here at this conference because we want to build ethical futures. And this is made challenging because some governments are actively throwing ethics out the window. Clearly, the fear of an unethical or an unsustainable future is not sufficient to drive ethical behaviour. Most governments are not trying to trash the place, they're trying to reach the targets built into the Sustainable Development Goals. This is Ireland and its progress towards Goal 12. The 5 boxes there represent targets within Goal 12. One of the challenges is that the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals carries an implicit dilemma. Sustainability and development may not go together. Many people argue that a focus on economic development results in short-term incremental solutions that do not address the deep ethical challenges that we face. When we look at these targets, they're not only timid, but they focus on what consumers can do. Of the 5 targets on the screen there, the only one the government takes responsibilities for is fossil fuels, and industry is not being driven to respond to any of them. Mariana Mazzucato at the University College London has developed a mission mapping method. It's been pretty widely adopted across some of these spaces, and it's designed to address wicked problems such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And we can see here the grand challenge or goal at the top might represent an SDG, the missions below that, the targets, and then we head towards the messy middle where she's using cross-sectoral collaborations to create individual impact projects between like-minded players. One of the reasons that she does that, one of the reasons why this is useful is because in that messy middle we have a lot of entrenched positions, and those entrenched positions drive part of the challenge of wicked problems. A number of researchers have tackled the way that we understand how these these entrenched positions are formed. George Kelly explored the patterns of beliefs that create personality types in 1963. 30 years later, Donald Shern and Martin Ryan explored the frames that people bring to policy spaces and how they cause people to interpret the same data or the same concepts differently. Since then, Martin Hager has developed a process incorporating the role of power that looks at discourse analysis and how the discourse in which people engage determines outcomes, entrenches their position, and allows them to hang on to the power required to maintain that position. Now, most of these, not so much Kelly, but at least frame reflection and discourse theory are qualitative in nature. What I've been trying to do is build a quantitative method of mapping these frames by identifying the configuration of concepts that determine the ideological positions. So this provides us a map of which concepts distinguish those positions, and so allows us to develop and position groups of impact projects based on a specific challenge. So the process is to correlate how often concepts appear together, identify conflicting sets of concepts, and map the result. So here we see one group that disagrees with a lot of other concepts but has broad agreement with another set of concepts. So I call this the stingray diagram for obvious reasons. My colleague, Dr. Luis Sanzoni, prefers to call it the stealth bomber diagram. I say, why go with the copy when you can join the original? Now, if we were to interpret this based on, say, the food security findings that I looked at, 188 submissions to the food security inquiry, we can see that the biggest stingray is business as usual. industry lobby groups, suppliers to the agribusiness sector, other people who benefit from the agribusiness sector, they all said grow more food. And so we can see grow more food stretches mostly across the diagram. It encompasses set 3 and set 4. The only people who disagree with that are set 5. So these are the radical approaches. People concerned about place-based, nature-based solutions, indigenous communities trying to grow their own food, and so they're not focused on that export model. Now, the high-tech food futures in block 2 there have some disagreements with some other farmers who are all interested in growing farm, who might be interested in nature-based regenerative farming, for example. They made up about 66% of the submissions. Now, there's about another 20% of submissions which I call systemic solutions. They involved ethical nutrition, which was popular across the whole body of systemic literature, and many of them called for a Ministry of Food. So hospitals, universities, welfare agencies, research institutes, they all said that if we put food at the centre of education, welfare and health, then we create a preventative well-being that connects people with each other, with nature and with their food. That stingray, the systemic solution stingray, was mentioned by the inquiry and largely ignored by the government because it didn't fit the paradigm of using food, of exporting food to grow the Australian economy. So the challenge that we have in creating ethical futures is how do we get governments and other players to recognise the importance of these alternative positions without trying to pick a fight or challenge the dominant concepts in the major point of view. That diagram is not very dissimilar to the one I came up with from talking to 40 food providers in Southeast Queensland. I only interviewed sustainable food providers, and what we can see is, again, we've got high-tech solutions snuggled into ag business there, and the other concepts that I came up with, food-related SMEs, community-based food programs and social justice, all have a relationship with government and largely map onto those yellow circles, which are terms used in the academic literature and in corporate sustainability reporting. But systemic change makers are sometimes deliberately out of view of the government. The other important thing is that the government is investing billions of dollars in the high-tech solutions and in onshoring food manufacturing, whereas it is providing some grants to food-related small and medium enterprises or to social enterprise, and it's treating most community-based food programs and social justice efforts as a welfare effort. So it's got a completely different response to these different parts of the food system, and it doesn't see them as part of an integrated whole. Interestingly, when I look across the literature, not just of food systems, but of sustainable business in general, I see the same tensions emerging that came out of these two inquiries into food. So we see tensions between the idea of using technology to decouple environmental harm and economic growth. Other people think we shouldn't be focusing on technology, we should be accepting sufficiency, or we should be engaging in degrowth. Now, most of us in this room would probably align ourselves with the options on the right-hand column. The challenge is that once we start to get down into the detail, we go back into that resonance and dissonance argument. For example, there's a lot of tension between guerrilla gardeners and local community groups. Local community groups want to bring the neighbours along, get agreement with everybody, work within government parameters and create solutions that are stable and can be in place for long term. The guerrilla gardeners say, no, this is too slow, we're not making sufficient change, and we need to disrupt the system by doing things unofficially. And so you can see that the tensions there would emerge. And so this is part of the challenge that we face, and somehow or other we need to identify ways to navigate these tensions. We'll come back to complexity and the other things there as we work through them. Now, when we talk about decoupling, we're comparing, on this graph, we're comparing the ecological footprint to the GDP. So the GDP is the dark dotted line, the gross domestic product. How much stuff do we produce? How many dollars are we pumping out? Now, as we get more technically efficient, as we implement solar panels and other sustainability measures, we gradually bring down the curve of the footprint away from GDP. So incremental change moves it below GDP, and so it goes on a different trajectory. The problem is that we want to start reducing our footprint. We don't want to decrease the rate at which our footprint's accelerating. We actually want to decrease the absolute footprint which we have. And not only do we want to decrease it, we want to decrease it at a rate where it falls below the planetary boundaries that we crossed some time ago. And so an arithmetic way to think about that is that impact equals population times affluence, ameliorated by technology. And so if we increase the population by 20% and make that entire population 20% richer, then technology has to be 44% more efficient to deal with the multiple increase in the footprint of those increased people using increased resources. And the question is whether technology can achieve that. Now, here's a graph from 2010. So these figures are 15 years old. Well, the figures are actually 20 years old. What we can see is that emissions, the black line, population, the red line, and affluence, the green line, have all been going up more or less a straight line over the 30 years of the graph. What suddenly happens though in about 2002 is that the emissions start to increase away from population and wealth. The reason for that is that the blue line shows the impact of technology on one particular number, on the per dollar emissions. So the amount of emissions for every dollar of GDP earned. What we can see is that we were getting more efficient at it, but then that efficiency ran out of steam around 2002. And so those pink circles at the end of these graphs show an upkick in total emissions because the technology is not overcoming the relationship between population, affluence and emissions. Now we can see that it was never driving it down very much, but it's failed to do that for a couple of years. Now, I don't have the current figures on a graph like this, but I have looked a lot at the arguments between degrowth people and decoupling people, and there are no really solid figures that show a capacity to decouple. So from my point of view, the arguments for degrowth are rock solid. I'm only one researcher working in that field. Now, I talked about systemic versus incremental change. One of the good news stories coming out of the food security inquiry was that regenerative beef farming has got the attention of the government, largely because very large investors have become interested in it and are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on ranches such as this one pictured in Montana, and we are seeing a major change in government attitudes towards regenerative beef farming. Now, we might think, great, we are seeing some progress and we have an example of decoupling in a particular industry in the food supply. My argument is that that's not systemic change. We don't make systemic change by solving one problem in the system. It's the nature of wicked problems that we can't solve them one variable at a time. We change one variable and it pops out of shape somewhere else. So in this example, just because the cows are not being industrially harmed, they're being regeneratively farmed, doesn't mean that we have less appetite for grassland and are going to stop deforestation. So to stop deforestation, we need to do more than just treat our cows well. A lot of the businesses that I spoke to said, well, sustainability is not that complex really. All I need to do is reduce my resource use, be more efficient about the way I use electricity and water, recycle more plastics, and then I'm moving towards sustainability. And so they are treating it as a simple problem. This diagram is known as the Kinefin diagram, and it maps out the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic situations. Now, a chaotic situation is where you can't even see what the problem is. Complex problem is the sort of problem we're dealing with, where there are so many vested interests, interdependent variables, suboptimal behaviour, and all of these other characteristics that mean that we can't isolate particular solutions and draw lines. Complicated problems are hard to see. They have an organic appearance, but when we break them, we can break them down, and when we break them down, we can break them down into a series of simple problems that we can solve. So building a freeway through the middle of a city, for example, is a complicated problem. No one denies that, but it can be done. All we need to do is solve all of the thousands of problems that in such a big project, one problem at a time. Some of the challenges in the space that we're talking about is that ideology, by its very nature, assumes a simple relationship. I believe this. I believe that if this were followed, then that would be the outcome. That's the nature of ideology. So we believe that we understand the world, and we believe that this is what is wrong with the world, and we believe that if we change this thing, then the world will be better. And so these simple solutions that we're seeing rolled out by populist governments want to stay in that simple space. They don't want to get too complicated. They don't want to get complex. One of the dangers is that if you stay there too long, you can fall into chaos. And what we're currently seeing in America this year is an example of that. By hanging on to that simple space, trying to get back to a pure, simple past where men were men, and we all knew the price of a pork belly, we can end up in chaos. The difference between complicated and complex is that we know what we're doing when things get complicated. We can still see how to pull apart the problems. One of the challenges is that if we don't understand what problem we're looking at, we don't understand which frame to use to solve it, then we will not manage to do so. One of the advantages of Mazzucato's mission mapping exercise is that what she is doing is recognising the complexity of the situation, using co-collaboration in that messy middle to create impact projects that are small enough that they can be mapped out using an impact map which the co-collaborating stakeholders can agree to. And so by reducing the scope of the project and the number of entrenched positions that we're trying to satisfy, we can create a complicated or a simple project and create a map towards an outcome. Now you'll notice that Mazzucato is still using the language of complexity, talking about potential, likelihood and iterative progress rather than cause and effect. What I'm talking about is building on that to actually map the middle and maximise the scale, the scope of the impact project and the number of entrenched positions that we can combine. Further, I want to start finding ways to increase the power of the less dominant paradigm by gathering up some of these loose values that may contribute to it and weaken the dominant paradigm. So some case studies. Here's a picture of my community garden in a set of 50 townhouses where I live. The power of nature is incredible. That was a lawn 3 years ago. The politics are unbelievable. We're constantly on a knife edge about whether the body corporate is going to shut us down or whatever. but the personal relationships inspired are heartwarming. That QR code there goes to an article I wrote for Green Agenda about this project and the politics and the implications of it. Here's a picture of the police threatening to tear down a guerrilla garden at the end of Boundary Street in West End. I've got a particular or a sentimental interest in this because I used to live in those white apartment blocks behind the trees. I created a community garden there 12 years ago that was bulldozed by the Department of Mines and Energy. The point of showing that to you now is to remind you that when we look at the relationship between governments and these radical outlier solutions, we see that they are not just blind to them, they are actively shutting them down. And there's the famous story of the South Los Angeles community garden that was something like 50 years old. It was actually changing the profile of the area to the extent where it was increasing property values, and the property developers lobbied the government to tear that community garden down because the land was now too valuable to have it being in the hands of the community. And so we are not in a position where we can leave government out of the picture. We have to somehow bring governments on board for creating the ethical futures that we want to see. One of the ways we're doing that at Food Connect, it's a community organisation, 550 careholders or shareholders own a community asset which operates as a food hub, trying to nurture and support food enterprises to create a network that can start to operate together more effectively and grow to the point where it can impact on existing food systems. One of the people who's been examining that process, the kinds of process that create that change, is Maya Goepel. She comes from an economic background, and she's realised that a lot of the theories of change, a lot of innovation theory assumes that market forces are going to drive change. Because sustainability requires some sacrifice, it cannot be driven by market forces. We cannot consume our way out of an environmental and ethical crisis, and so that requires a paradigm shift. I'm not going to torture you with another theoretical framework, but I do want to say that ethical futures will not emerge from going into battle with the dominant paradigm or simply by hoping that change will occur. We need to embrace the complexity and do the hard work required to allow narratives to emerge. So you might notice that I said allow narratives to emerge rather than replace the dominant paradigm. Whichever side of that particular tension you fall on, we need to identify the dissonance within the dominant ideology so that we can weaken its hold on the public imagination. We need to gather up those outliers that might connect the ethical alternatives, and so we need to agree to disagree on the dissonance among our collaborators so that we can achieve the outcomes that resonate with the ethical future that we desire. There's a lovely scene from Nate Nooga out near Carnarvon Gorge, just for us to look forward to a peaceful and calm future. Thank you for your time.